Right now, let's welcome my co-host, Jeff Small, president of Arbor Financial Services, a retirement income store located in Melbourne, Florida. Jeff is also our brand ambassador for our very own retirement income store and Amazon best-selling author of the book, Turning Financial Planning Right Side Up. We also want to welcome a good friend of the income generation, author, public speaker, Ed Slott. Ed was named the best source for IRA advice by the Wall Street Journal, and he's also been called America's IRA expert by Mutual Funds magazine. Ed's a good friend of the income generation once again, and we're happy to have him back. Ed, Thank you.
Great to be here, David. Thank you.
So what are some of the scariest things that you're hearing today from people who are worried, whether they're worried about the election, they're worried about the COVID-19 crisis, those that are retired or nearing retirement?
Well, I think number one is the panic about today's situation. And part of the scary things is that people are, I think, running too fast to raid their retirement accounts. We had this CARES Act and it lets you take money out. And a lot of people think this is free money. First of all, it's not free money. It's your own money. You're raiding your own retirement. Yes, you may have situations as a result of the pandemic, lost income, illness, whatever it is, but your retirement savings should be the absolute last resort. You should look to any other money, and it's taxable. The only real break on these, what they call these coronavirus-related distributions, is that you don't have to pay the 10% early withdrawal penalty if you're under 59 and a half, and you could spread the income over 3 years and even pay it back, which is not bad. But it shouldn't be your first inclination to say, oh, this is great, let me grab my retirement money, because history shows us that most people who take that money end up not being able to pay the tax, because let's say they take $10,000 out. If they need it that bad, they spend it. Then next year, it'd be worse than Halloween when they see that tax return and they say, but I already spent that money. I don't have the money for the tax now, and I don't have money to repay it. They're too quick on the draw for the retirement savings. And Congress had a good idea by providing relief, but it should only be a last resort. That should be the last place to go, your retirement savings, because it's the hardest to replace.
Well, people have to realize that, they're only getting maybe 70 cents on a dollar, whereas they could have had an entire dollar sitting there compounding, growing for their retirement. So it's an expensive proposition even after the CARES Act. Jeff?
Yeah, I know it's a very expensive proposition. I don't think that folks are really utilizing the CARES Act correctly, though, Ed. You're exactly right. But I want to throw you a curveball, Ed. You are the nation's foremost IRA expert. You get more publicity on knowing IRAs. I need clarification. Our viewers, our audience, our listeners need clarification. Why we don't put IRAs in trusts? Or do we put IRAs in trusts? Can you give us the pro and con on that in about a minute?
All right, in a minute, you never do it. First of all, it's the wrong terminology you have there. You never put an IRA in trust. I think what you mean, should you leave your IRA to a trust? Because if you put it in trust during your lifetime, you're taking the money out, it's gone. You don't have an IRA anymore, it's all taxable. I think the question you're asking is instead, should you leave it to a trust?
That's exactly right.
Yeah, all right. Now, why does anybody use a trust? You know why? My definition of a trust, when do you use a trust? When you don't trust, because if you trusted them, you wouldn't need a trust. So I call it a don't trust. That's when you use a trust, when you don't trust. When you're worried about, you could have a large IRA, maybe $1 million, and it took you a long time to earn that and build it up. And the last thing you want it to go to your children and grandchildren, but you don't want them squandering it or losing it to creditors, bankruptcy, lawsuits, second marriages, divorce, a whole host of items. So for those reasons, for protection and control post-death, that's when you might want to leave your IRA to a trust. But under the new Secure Act rules, even most of those trusts the money will have to be paid out within 10 years after death. And
right, so essentially, Ed, it doesn't do any good these days because, again, the money's got to come out. You can't run the money from the grave. So, Ed, we need to take a quick commercial break. We need to leave it there, but we want you to stick around. I want to have you right back in a minute. You stay with us, too. We'll be back here in a moment, coming up on the Income generation. We'll be right back. Right now, let's bring in my good friend and co-host, Jeff Small, along with a good friend of the income generation and today's guest, author and public speaker, Ed Slott. So Ed, you were about to make a point there when I talked about the fact that, gee, if it's got to come out from an IRA and pay taxes over 10 years, then you really can't run the money from the grave in these things you call don't trusts. And how about the tax rates when the money is in the trust?
Right. In other words, the funds have to be taxed and go into the trust by the end of the 10 years after death. But in certain trusts, the funds can stay in there and be protected, but then they're taxed at high trust tax rates. One of the solutions there is to do a Roth conversion now. And if you want both the low taxes and the trust protection, do a Roth conversion now and leave that Roth to a trust. But again, you're using the trust for generally personal non-tax reasons, post-death control, and to make sure that money is protected for the beneficiaries and from them.
Yeah, case in point, Ed, I've got a situation I'm dealing with 3 trustees from a benefactor's estate. None of the trustees get along. The money's in a trust right now, and they don't know what to do. And so what, as a fiduciary and advisor, can we do to help facilitate maybe the movement of that money? And what are the legalities of moving that money into another custodian? Are we able to do that?
Well, if it's IRA funds, it can only be moved by a trustee to trustee transfer, direct transfer. Now, just as an aside, after this Secure Act, which is in effect right now, most people don't even realize that because they're so focused on the pandemic, but many people might be better off without that 10-year rule, turning the IRAs, and that's not for everybody, but replacing it with life insurance, exchanging bad assets for good assets. I don't sell insurance, but if you need the trust protection, the life insurance going into a trust is a much more flexible asset to use in a trust. You don't have all the complex trust tax rules, no RMDs, and no taxes.
Well, Ed, that is such a great point, and I know you've started to talk more about this publicly, but why hasn't that caught fire? Because that option for life insurance, for converting a taxable asset into a tax-free asset, has been there forever. Why don't folks embrace that more?
I've been talking about, as you said, it's been in my books forever, but now with the Secure Act, I think all Congress did is incentivize us all to do the better planning we should have been doing all along. I mean, if you do that plan, you get everything every client of mine ever wanted. 3 things: larger inheritances, more post-death control, and less tax. Who cares how you get there? The IRA is no longer the vehicle. It's become a bad asset to use for estate planning, which is exactly what Congress wanted. So let's get rid of that jalopy and switch to a life insurance limo for the rest of the ride.
Good point. Ed, speaking about Congress, what do you think Congress needs to do at this point, where they're all wrestling about the second version of a CARES Act? If you were sitting there, what would you propose?
I would have them get more money into individuals' hands. People need money. I'm no expert on all of this. I'm a tax guy, but there's no question they should keep going with the unemployment insurance benefits. People are desperate for that money. And when you put money in people's hands that need the money, they will spend it. And that's been generating growth in the economy, even in light of the pandemic. They're so worried about billions here and billions here to these other industries, but they won't survive, these industries, unless people have money in their hands to be able to buy things that they need. I'm not always that way because you don't want a free-for-all, but these are unusual times and people need more help than ever before. People are not working because they don't want to work. They're not working because the jobs are gone and some may never come back.
So people have money in their hands so they don't have to worry about all the basics that they need. Now, when you get past that level, in the last 2 minutes, tell our viewers and our listeners, please, what you think are the most important things they need to focus on if they're part of the income generation to get past this point so they can still reach their long-term retirement goals.
Well, it always comes down, there are books on all of this, but every book on saving for retirement or having income comes down to 2 things: earn more, create more, earn more, and spend less. It's math. that's always going to come down. If our government knew that, we wouldn't have these giant budget deficits. You can't spend what you don't have.
Okay. And today, in terms of tax deferred plans, what's the best advice for them in terms of determining which tax deferred plans should they focus on? Should they be maxing out the 401k? Should they be doing a Roth IRA? What's your best advice in the final minute on this segment?
I don't even like tax deferred anymore. IRAs or 401ks, everything should be piled into tax-free vehicles like Roth IRAs and Roth 401ks, because it's the only hedge against the uncertainty of what future higher rates can do to your retirement savings. Plus, in a low tax rate environment, the cost of converting to a Roth or losing the deduction is not as big of a cost. But nobody wants a big tax bill later on in retirement when the paychecks stop and they're the most vulnerable. Now, in a low tax rate environment, deductions aren't even worth as much. I say go Roth and go tax-free, or use the life insurance plan I talked about. But whatever you do, you have to start building tax-free as a hedge, a shelter against future higher taxes. The day is coming. We just don't know when.
Yeah, I find so many people that put all their money in a 401k, and now when they get into retirement, they can't even buy a car without having to take a withdrawal from their 401k and paying all the taxes. So at bare minimum, people need to be balanced in the taxation types of their accounts. So Ed, thanks so much. As usual, it's been our pleasure having you.
Okay, thanks.
And thank you too for watching, but stay with us. We have a lot more coming up right here on The Income Generation. We'll be right back.